He didn't belong there. Not with the polished boots, the bidding wars, or the flashing cameras. Grady Holt showed up in a truck held together by rust and prayers. They laughed, called him lost, outmatched, delusional. But when the wild black Mustang, untouched, unbroken, feared, locked eyes with him, everything stopped. No one spoke. Not even the horse. And in that silence, a new kind of trust began. He didn't come to win. He came to listen. And what happened next rewrote every rule they thought they knew. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The wind in Flagstaff, Arizona always carried a bite after dusk, even in early autumn. That evening, the air was crisp and electric, laced with the scent of pine and distant wildfire smoke. Above, the sky stretched wide and velvet black, scattered with stars sharp enough to pierce. Beneath that sky, at the edge of town, the floodlights of the Flagstaff Wildstock auction grounds glared down on polished chrome trailers, satin-lined cowboy hats, and an eager, murmuring crowd of the powerful and proud. Men in creased jeans and $1,000 boots puffed cigars by the corral fence. Women in designer fringe jackets clutched leather-bound catalogs, their eyes hunting pedigree and prestige. This was no ordinary horse sale. It was a battlefield of wealth, legacy, and ego. In the heart of the auction grounds, surrounded by heavy oak rails and chatter thick with speculation, stood the main attraction, Ash Storm. Ash Storm was a sight that caught in the throat. A black Mustang stallion with a coat like obsidian fire, he moved like smoke with muscle, fluid, coiled, unpredictable. The whites of his eyes glared beneath a tangled forelock, and a jagged scar sliced down his left shoulder like a brand left by war. His age was estimated between 8 and 10, but the years had not dulled his spirit. He was defiance in hoof and hide, a creature who'd thrown off every saddle and man who dared mount him. No trainer had lasted more than 3 days. Most didn't last 3 minutes. Ash Storm pawed the dirt, tail flicking, ears pinned, as a young handler stood outside his pen, sweat blooming through his pearl-snap shirt. The handler, Mason Tully, was local, 23, with the ambition of someone trying to prove his worth too fast. Thin, pale, wiry like a colt himself, Mason had inherited nerves from a line of rodeo men, but none of their fame. "He's a killer," Mason muttered to a rancher watching nearby. "He'll break your bones just for blinking wrong. Damn near shattered my ribs on Thursday." Inside the arena's main tent, the energy buzzed like static. Spotlights pooled on the ring, illuminating hay-scattered ground where lesser horses had been paraded and priced. But the whispers weren't about bloodlines anymore. They were about Ash Storm, and who, if anyone, would dare bid on him. That's when the truck rolled in. A battered 1988 Chevy pickup, paint sun-bleached to rust, growled into the gravel parking lot. Its engine coughed like an old smoker, its headlights flickered, and its hood wore the dust of forgotten roads. It rumbled between blacked-out Range Rovers and chrome-plated horse haulers, like a ghost of a world no one wanted to remember. A few heads turned, then turned away, until the door creaked open. Grady Holt stepped out. He stood just under 6 feet, broad-shouldered but worn down like river stone. His skin was leathered from sun, his beard a salt and pepper bramble that covered most of a strong, quiet jaw. His eyes were a dark, thundercloud blue, calm, unreadable, tired. He wore a faded flannel shirt, jeans with one too many patches, and boots cracked by years of hard ground. A tattered ball cap shaded his face, the bill stitched with the words, "Ride quiet, mean it." Grady had once been well known in certain circles, long ago before he walked away. A decorated Mustang Wrangler from southern Utah, famous for his gentle touch and silent approach, he vanished without explanation after a tragic training accident claimed a young colt's life. Some said he'd lost his nerve. Others whispered it was grief. Whatever the truth, he hadn't been seen at an event like this in over a decade. He didn't scan the crowd or smile for old friends. He walked with a deliberate stillness, hands in his pockets, straight toward the pens like a man called by something other than money. The crowd parted, then closed behind him with murmurs. "Is that Holt?" whispered a gray-haired cowboy to his wife. "I thought he was dead." The woman didn't answer. She just followed Grady's path with her eyes, something shifting in her gaze. Grady stopped in front of Ash Storm's pen. The horse turned. At first it was subtle, just a flick of the ear. Then Ashstorm's entire posture changed. He stopped pacing. His muscles went tight, but not in aggression. His head lifted, eyes locked onto Grady's. The scarred stallion let out a low snort, and for a single breathless moment, stood still. Mason Tully blinked in disbelief. "What the hell?" he muttered. Ashstorm had never stilled for anyone, not once, not even when sedated. Grady didn't move closer, didn't speak. He only tipped his head slightly, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, before turning away and heading toward the registration booth. The woman at the desk, Delilah Grant, was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense bun, and a clipboard for a shield. She had the clipped efficiency of someone who'd wrangled cattle and men both. When she looked up and saw Grady, her pen paused mid-checkmark. "Well," she said flatly, "the ghosts walk tonight." Grady didn't smile. "Still got paddles?" She handed him one with the number 47. "Try not to break the bank," she added. "No promises," he said, and turned toward the ring. Inside, the announcer's voice boomed through cheap speakers. "And now, the moment y'all been waiting for, Flagstaff's own living legend, Ashstorm." Applause erupted, some half-hearted, some eager, some gleefully malicious, hoping to see another fool fail. Grady found a spot near the edge of the tent, standing with arms crossed, eyes steady. Across the arena, a new bidder emerged. Gavin Crestridge, a venture capitalist from Denver with slicked-back blonde hair, crocodile boots, and a diamond earring. Known for buying wild horses and turning them into status symbols, Gavin flashed a grin and lifted his paddle high. 50,000, he called. 60, shouted another rancher. Grady said nothing. 80, 125. Gavin stood again, cool as ice, winking at the camera crew he'd brought with him. Then, Grady lifted his paddle. 200. The room fell quiet, heads turned. Mason's jaw dropped. Delilah, watching from her booth, muttered to herself, "He's really doing it." Ashstorm, still behind the pen, reared slightly, as if he too had heard something shift. Gavin laughed, raising an eyebrow. 300. Grady answered with a single word, 4. The tent pulsed with disbelief. Gavin's smile thinned. 500. 6. A breath. 750. Grady didn't blink. 8. Ashstorm let out a breathless huff, stamping once. The auctioneer looked stunned. 800,000 going once, going twice. The gavel slammed. Sold to number 47. The arena erupted into murmurs, some astonished, some mocking. A man in rags had just bought the wildest horse in Arizona for nearly $1 million. Grady stood still, his eyes never leaving the stallion. Ashstorm stared back. Something ancient passed between them. Trust not yet born, but possible. The moment the gavel came down, a ripple of silence moved across the auction tent like a slow wave. Then came the clamor. Voices rose, some in disbelief, others in hushed suspicion. The crowd that had moments ago laughed at the man in the dusty flannel now buzzed with a kind of stunned, uncertain respect. Grady Holt didn't bask in the attention. He simply lowered his paddle and nodded once toward Ashstorm's pen. The stallion didn't rear or thrash. He just watched. Behind the booth, Delilah Grant scribbled furiously into her ledger, her brows pulled into a rare furrow of doubt. 800, she whispered to herself. What kind of man bets his life savings on a ghost horse? But the real storm was brewing 3 rows down, in the padded VIP section lined with folding leather chairs and silver water buckets. There sat Carter Blaine. Carter was the sort of man who never raised his voice. He didn't have to. In his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his posture alone announced ownership. His face was clean-shaven and symmetrical, the kind of look that made magazine editors swoon and politicians return calls. A custom-tailored navy blazer hugged his frame. His boots were crocodile skin, dyed oxblood red, polished to a mirror sheen. His dark blonde hair, slicked back with precision, never moved, like the man himself. He leaned forward slowly, elbows on knees, clasping his hands together as his icy blue gaze locked onto Grady. Carter had built Blaine Tech, a venture capital empire that specialized in acquisition, whether it be companies, land, or rare animals. His interest in Ashstorm wasn't just sport, it was personal. He had lost a prize stallion 3 years earlier to a wildfire in Montana, and Ashstorm had, in his mind, the fire and lineage to fill that void. Next to Carter sat Natalie Wren, his assistant and occasional handler of PR disasters. Natalie, in her early 30s, was sharply dressed in a graphite gray pantsuit, her raven black bob curling just under her chin. Her green eyes flicked from Carter to Grady, then to the murmuring crowd. Efficient to a fault, Natalie had grown up in Philadelphia, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse. Her no-nonsense pragmatism was hard-earned and armor-plated. "You want me to dig on him?" she asked, thumbing open her phone. "Already did," Carter replied, voice low, smooth. "Grady Holt, used to be someone, disappeared after the Sweetwater incident, came back tonight with a paddle and an attitude." Natalie glanced toward the registration tent. "You think it's real?" Carter's jaw flexed. That horse stood still for him, didn't it? On the far side of the tent, Grady stood alone. No handshake from the auction staff, no congratulations, just whispers, like a swarm of flies in Sunday silence. From his inside pocket, he withdrew a folded envelope and walked it to the payment window. Behind the desk sat Wanda McClure, Flagstaff native and lifelong bookkeeper, well into her 60s, with a shock of white curls and bifocals that slid down her nose. She eyed Grady like a suspicious cat. "We don't do IOUs," she said flatly. "Wasn't planning on one," Grady replied, handing her the envelope. Wanda opened it, expecting trouble. Instead, she pulled out a certified cashier's check made out to the full amount, signed by Sage Haven Foundation, a little-known nonprofit based out of Bisbee that funded second chances for animals deemed unmanageable or unadoptable. Wanda blinked once, then twice. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, glancing up at Grady again, this time with something approaching respect. Back at the pen, Ashstorm had begun to pace. But it wasn't the erratic, nervous circling from earlier. It was measured, almost expectant, his eyes flicking every few seconds toward the arena's exit. A few handlers had gathered near the fence, including Mason Tully, arms folded tight, chewing a sliver of hay between his teeth. "You ever seen a wild horse act like that?" asked Shelby Kinross, one of the junior trainers. A stocky woman in her late 20s with copper skin and a wide mouth usually turned into a smirk. Her long braid whipped behind her denim jacket in the evening wind. Mason spat. "He's just tired. Give it a day. He'll turn hellfire again." Shelby chuckled. "Sure, but tonight, he's following that man with his eyes like he's already been claimed." Grady returned, quiet as ever, just as Lyle Thorne, the auction stage manager, waved toward him. "Time to collect your beast, Mr. Holt." "Wouldn't call him that," Grady replied as he stepped toward the steel gate. Ashstorm's ears perked. He stopped pacing. The entire arena leaned in, phones lifted, breath caught. Grady didn't bring a lead rope, no bridle, no commands. He opened the gate himself, slow and steady. Ashstorm didn't bolt, he didn't rear, he waited. Grady stepped inside, boots crunching hay, and the black stallion lowered his head. They stood for several heartbeats, still as shadows under floodlight, before Grady turned and walked toward the open gate. Ashstorm followed, not out of obedience, out of choice. The silence that followed was not disbelief. It was reverence. Outside, under the tall pines and cooling sky, Grady led Ashstorm to the gravel lot where his trailer sat crooked between million-dollar rigs. A few men chuckled behind cupped palms. Someone snapped a photo, but no one moved to interfere. Natalie watched from a distance, lips pursed. "He's going to ride that storm all the way home." Carter Blaine stood beside her, arms folded. His eyes weren't on Grady, though. They were on Ashstorm. "Call the board," he said. "If we can't own the horse, we'll buy the ranch." Natalie blinked. "What ranch?" "He'll have one. Men like that always build sanctuaries." As Ashstorm loaded into the trailer without so much as a stomp, Grady closed the latch with a quiet click. A few minutes later, the truck wheezed into gear, taillights glowing like two dim embers as it rolled into the Arizona night. The sun had not yet fully risen when Grady Holt pulled into the gravel path that curved like a scar through High Pine Ranch. Nestled just west of Flagstaff's forest edge, the ranch was a patchwork of cedar-planked fencing, uneven terrain, and salvaged structures weathered by time and purpose. The buildings leaned slightly with age, but they stood, like Grady himself. He parked the truck with a sigh, climbed down, and unlatched the trailer door. Ashstorm stood inside, his massive body taut and slick with dried sweat. His eyes glinted in the dawn light, still sharp, still searching. But something was different. He hadn't kicked during the ride. Not once. He had stood still in the rumbling dark, as if sensing that whatever lay ahead might not be a trap. Grady didn't force him. He stepped back and waited. After several long seconds, the stallion took a breath, then another, and stepped down onto the unfamiliar dirt. His hooves crunched the pine needles and gravel, his nostrils flaring at the scent of old wood, animals, and freedom. The ranch's only other inhabitants stirred awake. A pair of goats bleated in the distance, and a lean brindle dog with a torn left ear came trotting up from the barn, tail cautious but wagging. This was Huck, a 7-year-old mutt Grady had rescued from a ditch on a freezing January night 3 winters ago. Huck was lean, wolfish, with a wary intelligence and the kind of loyalty that didn't ask for attention. He stopped 10 feet from Ashstorm, sniffed the air, then sat down, watching. Grady let the gate to the round pen swing open and walked in ahead of Ashstorm. The stallion hesitated at the threshold. The gate creaked as it settled. A soft breeze stirred the pine trees overhead. "Your move," Grady murmured, and stepped aside. Ashstorm blinked. Then, slowly, he stepped inside the pen. By mid-morning, the ranch had begun to stir. 2 ranch hands arrived in a dusty Ford flatbed, pulling off gloves and stretching stiff backs. Maria Chavez was first out of the cab, short and wiry with a sharp tongue and a sharper intuition. At 34, she'd spent most of her life between animal shelters and private ranch work, always favoring the misfits, the 3-legged dogs, the wild-eyed colts, the ones nobody thought worth saving. She carried herself with brisk efficiency and wore her thick black hair pulled into a braided crown. Her boots were scuffed, her hoodie faded, but her presence was unmistakable, capable, blunt, and fiercely loyal to those who earned it. She squinted toward the pen, hands on her hips. "So that's the one, huh?" she muttered. Her work partner, Big Jim Radley, climbed down from the passenger seat. 42 years old, 6'4" and built like a barn himself, Jim had the quiet disposition of a man who'd grown up around noise and chosen peace. His hands were scarred from years of hauling wire, breaking ice, and pulling calves. His beard was thick and peppered with gray, and his Stetson looked like it had been sat on more than once. Jim peered toward the pen. "That horse looks like he's trying to remember if the world's real." Maria scoffed. "He's remembering if people are worth the trouble." Grady gave them a brief nod, but said nothing. He was sitting cross-legged outside the pen, hat pulled low, eyes closed, breathing slow and measured like he wasn't just watching the horse. He was with him. Ashstorm circled the pen, stopping occasionally to sniff the rails. He didn't bolt, he didn't strike, but he didn't relax either. His tail flicked sharply, and his muscles rippled at every sudden noise. But Grady didn't move, didn't coax, he just stayed, present. "Coffee?" Maria asked, holding out a chipped mug. Grady accepted it without looking up. "Thanks." "Name's Maria," she said. "Grady," he replied. "We know." She chuckled and leaned against the post. "So what's the plan? You gonna ride him by sundown?" Grady shook his head. "Just gonna let him breathe." That first day, Grady didn't touch Ashstorm once. He didn't try to feed him, didn't throw a blanket over him. He sat, watched, waited. When the sun dipped low behind the trees and the air turned gold and cool, he left a bucket of water and hay just outside the pen and walked away. The second day was the same. On the third day, Ashstorm took 2 bites from the hay and stood still as Grady approached the fence, never flinching but never turning away. By the 6th day, the ranch had settled into a rhythm around the stallion's presence. Other animals grew curious but gave him space. Huck would lie outside the pen for hours, tail thumping gently whenever Ashstorm came near. Maria and Big Jim worked quietly, giving Grady a wide berth, but watching, always watching. It was on the 7th morning that Grady led Ashstorm toward the back pasture, past the lean-to barn, and down a path that cut through scrub oak and pine. There, nestled in a small dip between 2 ridges, was a simple wooden bridge, no more than 15 feet long, built from thick planks and iron nails. It spanned a rocky creek bed that trickled with cold, clear water. Ashstorm stopped the moment he saw it. His ears shot back. His breath came fast. He tossed his head once and tried to turn away. Grady didn't hold tight. He didn't speak. He simply dropped the lead rope and walked ahead, crossing the bridge alone. At the far end, he turned and sat down in the grass, arms resting on his knees. Ashstorm pawed at the ground. He snorted. The water wasn't deep, but the sound of it over stones spooked him. He turned in a tight circle, pacing, uncertain. The wind shifted. A hawk cried somewhere high above. Grady didn't move. From behind a nearby cedar, Maria and Jim watched, silent. He always this patient? Maria whispered. Jim nodded. I've seen him wait out a thunderstorm with a panicked mule. Took 4 hours, never raised his voice. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 20. At 32 minutes, Ashstorm dropped his head. He stepped forward. One hoof touched the first plank. It groaned under his weight, then the second and third. Grady never moved. When Ashstorm reached the other side, the stallion stopped in front of him. His sides were heaving, but his eyes were calm. Grady stood slowly and didn't reach out. He only nodded. Good, he said softly. That's good. It started with a quiet click. Maria Chavez, ever the skeptic, hadn't meant to record anything profound. She only wanted to show her cousin back in Tucson the crazy horse she worked near. But when Ashstorm placed his hooves on the rickety wooden bridge, 1 step, then 2, then all the way across, something made her phone stay steady in her hands. She didn't zoom, didn't edit. She uploaded it that evening with a simple caption. He chose to trust. That's all it took. Within 24 hours, the video had gone viral. It wasn't just the horse world that took notice. Animal lovers, trauma survivors, even parenting blogs picked up the thread. There was something raw and quiet in that clip. Grady Holt seated cross-legged in the grass, motionless as stone, while a massive, scarred Mustang crossed a personal chasm. Grady didn't have a smartphone. He found out from Maria the next morning over coffee. You've got 100,000 views, she said, scrolling through the comments with a stunned look. No, wait, 120 and climbing. Grady stirred sugar into his chipped blue mug and said nothing. Outside, Ashstorm grazed in the open pen, ears flicking gently at the breeze. A flock of finches exploded from the pines, and the stallion barely flinched. You've got messages, Maria added. Reporters, bloggers, some woman from a morning show wants to fly in and do a segment. A guy from Nashville says he wants to film a docuseries called The Mustang Mind. Grady grunted. Maria looked up from her phone. You're not going to answer any of them, are you? Nope. By midday, High Pine Ranch had become something it had never been, a point of curiosity. A white pickup with a satellite dish rolled up the dirt path, and a man in khakis with a clipboard tried to schedule an interview through the front gate. He was met by Big Jim Radley, who stood with one boot up on a hay bale, chewing on a piece of straw. Sorry, Jim said, voice slow and calm. Boss ain't taking guests. The man frowned. Can we leave a press packet? You can leave it in the chicken coop, Jim replied. That evening, another car came. Sleek, dark, and humming like a cat. A black Cadillac SUV with tinted windows pulled up near the barn. Out stepped Carter Blaine. He wore a steel gray suit with no tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone in casual defiance. His watch gleamed under the setting sun, and his cologne reached before he did. Carter walked like the world moved for him until he saw Grady. Grady stood at the far end of the yard, mending a gate latch. He didn't look up until Carter's polished shoes crunched through the gravel. I see you made the news, Carter said, smiling without warmth. Grady nodded once. Didn't invite it? Carter's eyes scanned the landscape. The ranch wasn't glamorous, just functional. Weathered fences, feed bins patched with tarp, and a barn that leaned slightly to the left. You've got something rare here, he said, voice smoother than whiskey. And I don't just mean the horse. I figured that's what brought you. Carter smiled wider. Straight to the point. Good. I'll make this simple, Holt. I want Ashstorm. I'll offer you $2 million, cash, and I'll fund the ranch. Build new facilities, state-of-the-art equipment, a full veterinary wing. You can hire more help, take in more rescues. You'll even get a seat on the board. Grady wiped his hands on a towel and studied Carter's face. Your name goes on everything, I assume. Of course, branding matters, but I'm not taking him away. You keep him, train him, ride him. Let him be the face of the Blaine Legacy Fund. We'll change the industry together. A breeze stirred. The sound of wind chimes clinked faintly from the porch. I've seen what money builds, Blaine, Grady said. It builds arenas, labels, spectacle. It doesn't build trust. You think trust feeds a dozen horses through winter? Carter snapped, the charm cracking. You've got a golden opportunity here. Don't throw it away out of pride. Grady stepped past him and toward the paddock. Ashstorm stood watching, still and focused. As Grady approached, the stallion walked toward the gate to meet him. Grady laid a hand on the animal's shoulder, voice soft. You can build a barn, he said, not turning back. But you can't build what happens in a moment like this. Carter's jaw clenched. "You'll regret this." "I've regretted worse," Grady replied. Carter left without another word, his tires spitting gravel down the path. Maria stepped out from the shadows of the barn, arms folded. "You just turned down more money than I've ever seen," she said quietly. Grady didn't answer. He stroked Ashstorm's neck, then turned to her. "Some things don't come with a price tag." The following week, letters started arriving, some handwritten, others typed. Survivors of abuse, veterans with PTSD, parents of children who hadn't spoken in years. They all wrote the same thing in different words. "Thank you. Thank you for showing that silence isn't weakness, that stillness isn't surrender, that even something wild and broken can choose to trust." Jim built a wooden box on the porch labeled letters. They filled it every few days. Ashstorm's fame didn't fade, it deepened. At the edge of the paddock, a small boy with one arm approached the fence during a quiet Saturday visit. He didn't say anything, just watched. Grady knelt beside him. "You want to meet him?" The boy nodded. Grady unlatched the gate, keeping his hand loose on the rope. Ashstorm stepped forward, slow and calm. The boy lifted his hand. Ashstorm lowered his head. Their fingers touched muzzle. The boy laughed. Quiet. Pure. Maria watched from the barn window, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her flannel. "This ain't a ranch anymore," she whispered. "It's a miracle in motion." Grady just called it another day well spent. The mornings at High Pine Ranch began the same, no matter how many headlines tried to change it. The sun climbed slow over the Ponderosa Ridge, draping golden light across the corrals and casting long shadows between weather-worn rails. Chickens rustled near the feed bins. Huck the dog limped out from under the porch with his usual yawn-stretch hop. And Grady Holt emerged from the barn with a tin mug of coffee, steam curling like smoke from an old fire. Ashstorm stood in the main paddock, his black coat glistening in the soft light, mane tangled but proud. He'd grown stronger these past weeks, his body filling out with muscle and ease. He still flinched at sudden noises, still bristled when strangers lingered too long, but he no longer lived in fear. He lived in readiness, as if something in him had begun to believe the worst had already passed. Inside the barn, the scent of hay mixed with oil and cedar. On the far wall, framed between two support beams, hung a new addition, a painting sent by mail without a return address. The style was raw, impressionistic, but unmistakable. Grady seated in the grass, Ashstorm mid-stride on the wooden bridge, the Arizona light caught in his mane like fire. Below the image, scrawled in charcoal, "Not everything wild needs taming. Some things just need someone who stays." Grady had stared at the note for a long time before pinning it to the beam with a rusted horseshoe nail. He didn't speak of it, didn't ask who had sent it. But Maria saw him glance at it each morning, the way a soldier might nod to a flag folded in glass. It was Maria who organized the visit. "They're from Red Hollow," she said one afternoon, clipboard in hand. "Kids from the foster group, just for the afternoon. Snacks, a few safe animals to pet, nothing too loud." Grady looked up from mending a fence rail. "Ashstorm's not ready." Maria raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's him you're worried about?" Grady sighed and stood. "Fine, but only if they stay outside the main paddock." The day came sunny and cool, the sky clear enough to see the snowcaps on the distant San Francisco peaks. A white shuttle bus rattled up the dirt path and stopped beside the goat pen. Out stepped a woman in her late 40s, petite and energetic, her brown hair tied back in a practical bun. She wore a windbreaker with a Red Hollow logo stitched over her heart and carried a satchel of juice boxes and wipes. This was Elaine Price, coordinator of Red Hollow Foster Outreach. A former social worker who had spent 20 years balancing bureaucracy with heartbreak, Elaine had the warm, efficient kindness of someone who had seen too much to waste time pretending. She introduced the kids one by one, names barely heard as they darted across the yard, wide-eyed and eager. There were 10 in total. Ranging from 4 to 11, most wore mismatched jackets and thrifted shoes. Some ran toward the goats, giggling. Others hung back, eyeing the horses with wary fascination. Grady stayed near the barn, arms folded, observing. One boy stood apart. He was about 7, pale and slight, with a mop of brown curls and oversized jeans cuffed twice at the ankles. He didn't speak, didn't smile. Just watched from beneath the brim of a too-big baseball cap with the logo of a faded minor league team. Elaine approached Grady quietly. "That's Noah," she said. "Selective mutism. Been with us about 6 months, doesn't talk, doesn't touch, doesn't really do much of anything, but he wanted to come. Grady nodded once. As the visit wore on, the other kids brushed ponies, fed chickens, and let the goats nibble crackers from their palms. Maria led a group in a circle to pet Huck, who wagged politely, tail sweeping the dust. Big Jim sat near the feed barn, carving wood with an old whittling knife, letting the kids watch, but never offering a word unless asked. Noah still lingered alone. Ashstorm had been moved to a smaller turnout pen for the day, well away from the activity. He stood beneath the shade of a cottonwood, shifting his weight, watching. His eyes tracked every child, every noise, not nervous, just attentive. Grady watched them both. Then, without a word, Noah began walking toward the turnout. Elaine reached to stop him, but Grady held up a hand. Let him. The boy moved slow, almost unsure of his own body. Step by step, he approached the fence. Ashstorm didn't shy. His ears twitched forward, his nostrils flared. He took one step forward, then another. Noah stopped just short of the gate. He reached out. The stallion, majestic and quiet, lowered his head. Their fingers met. No sounds, no photos. Just a moment. The boy pressed his palm flat against the warm velvet of Ashstorm's muzzle, and for the first time since his arrival at Red Hollow, Noah smiled. Tears welled in Elaine's eyes. Maria turned away, pretending to sneeze. Jim muttered a prayer of thanks into the collar of his coat. Grady didn't move, but his jaw worked, and he blinked once, slow and deliberate. The sun dipped behind the trees by the time the bus pulled away. The kids waved from the windows. Noah pressed his hand against the glass. Ashstorm stood at the fence until the taillights vanished. That night, Grady sat on the porch, Huck curled at his feet. Maria joined him with 2 mugs of tea and no words. The stars came out, slow and sparse, like secrets too old to tell. From the paddock, Ashstorm nickered once, low and soft. "You think we're making a difference?" Maria asked finally. Grady looked out into the dark. "No," he said, "I think he is." She smiled and leaned back in the creaky chair beside him. "You ever going to name this place?" Grady thought for a long while. "Don't need to," he said. "Folks already know what it is." Not everything wild needs to be tamed. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from quiet patience, the willingness to stay, to listen, and to let healing happen on its own time. In a world that often values noise, speed, and control, this story reminds us that trust can't be forced, and respect can't be bought. It must be earned, moment by moment. Whether you're raising a child, caring for a pet, or learning to forgive yourself, the lesson is the same. Be present, be patient, stay long enough for the broken to feel safe again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment to tell us what part moved you most, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where kindness speaks louder than power.